Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Up next, President of the Capital Research Center, Scott Walter, is on with us, and he's done some great research into the connections between prominent groups and what is now at the front and the foremost of the news media coverage, Black Lives Matter, BLM. And Scott, welcome to the program. How are you doing, sir?
Great to be with you.
So, obviously, when you see groups that can marshal large crowds of people at almost seemingly a moment's notice, the first indication usually is, okay, what's going on here?
Well, there's two things. There's both money and organization. It doesn't necessarily take a lot of money immediately to get people on the streets. What's really important is the preparation ahead of time so that one can organize on a dime. And the left is good both at that and at eventually making money off this too.
How are they? I mean, is it just the fear of losing an election? Is it the fear of more rioting, more unrest in the streets? Because that's what fascinates me is when you look at the Tides Foundation and some of these groups, and you say, am I missing the profit motive? Do I just not see it in enough dimensions to see, how, this kind of chaos can reap benefits for some of these groups?
Well, in the case of the protests and riots, I think the answer is, you have some completely unpredictable event like the George Floyd murder, but then the second something happens, you're already prepared and you leap on it so that you make it into a media spectacle, and then that drives people to websites and to donation buttons. So, blacklivesmatter.com, that website's been up for, the past 4 years. But it wasn't getting a lot of traffic most of the time, wasn't having a lot of people hit donate. But George Floyd becomes a fantastic opportunity to drive traffic to that site, and there is a donate button, and they are happy to take your money.
And then, of course, there are salaries to be made and pass-through rates that I'm sure are stunningly low. I've seen things as low as like 1/3 of every dollar given actually makes it anywhere that you might think it's getting, Scott. So take us into that. But also, is there a profit to be made by distracting from the point that the president has, in some cases, but not nearly as much as I thought he would, make the case that these are almost entirely Democrat-run, 24/7. It hasn't been a Republican in office in decades in most of these cities or governments, and their law enforcement is out just enforcing the laws that the left has been making all along.
Well, you raise a great point there, which is, let's take the case of the Floyd. That was Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now, there's a black chief of police in Minneapolis. There's a Democrat mayor. And I don't believe that there's been a Republican mayor in quite some years. So and then who is the highest law enforcement official in the state of Minnesota?
Keith Ellison.
Exactly. A black man, a Muslim, and an explicit Antifa supporter. Now, that is not a white, male, conservative, Republican power structure, as far as I can tell. And by the way, 1973 was the last time you had a Republican in office as mayor of Minneapolis. So, this is part of the many irrationalities and outrages. The idea that this is somehow the brutal cis hetero patriarchy of old white rich Republican conservative men,
right,
is just laughable.
But that's what I think these riots seem to distract us from covering, or at least discussing the fact that these are guys like Keith Ellison, making these laws. So now we've been drawn away, and we're just saying, oh my gosh, what statue is going to come down next, instead of really dealing with the issue, which has been, as I've looked at it, and Scott, I'd love to hear your thought on this, since 1964, when Lyndon Johnson started the war on poverty and the Great Society. This is what we're waking up to, a happy weekend morning in the Great Society.
Well, yes. In addition to the power structure, which is not remotely anything related to the standard demons, the other point to be looked at is the policies, right? Mm-hmm. Are there wonderful educational policies in the city of Minneapolis? No. Are the schools flourishing? No. Are they providing poor people of color with a great education or any educational choice for their children? No. Are the welfare systems that have, as you say, been in existence since the 60s? Are they lifting people out of poverty? No. So it's horrific. These things are happening in our big cities, which are absolutely ruled by the left and have been for decades, and the policies have failed. Before we try to explain why or whatever else, let's just be clear. They have failed, and it was on the watch of left-wing folks and Democrat folks, not anybody like the folks who work for you in Virginia.
No, absolutely. Well, and the conservative minds are actually the ones who are saying, let's get school choice, let's get more economic opportunity, let's deregulate business. So, and part and parcel, I think that this was why you were seeing even Gallup polling data showing that the black community had warmed to the president in ways no Republican president certainly had ever enjoyed popularity in the black community in the 30 percentile, which, granted, doesn't sound like a lot until you realize he won in 2016 with 8% of the black vote. Growing that to 30-something% could have led to a runaway, and I wonder if there isn't some of that that's behind this. Now, you've done some great research into the groups behind the BLM protests and all of the rioting. Is any of this kind of trying to win back the black community from the president, which it seemed like they were, in great capacity to lose in 2020?
Well, I think you're right. That the smart folks on the left know that if they don't have their favorite voting blocks, including persons of color, massively behind them, then they're in deep electoral trouble. And obviously, the president's policies until the COVID mess were definitely benefiting blacks in cities to a tremendous degree. And you're right; they don't have to. The other side doesn't need 80-90% of the black vote to have spectacular victories. It needs just a few percentage points more. I mean, I don't think many Americans appreciate this, but the smartest folks on the left do. If they lose even a small fraction of their traditional constituencies, then they just collapse electorally. Mm-hmm. And by the way, in Pennsylvania in 2016, I've seen it pointed out that Hillary Clinton's loss of black voters compared to Obama is the margin of her loss in the presidential race in Pennsylvania and the margin of the victory for the Republican Senate candidate. So, it's not a big number.
But it's significant because it completely changes the tenor of the election.
Exactly. So let's put it this way. This kind of unrest is making folks in Soros-funded entities gleeful at the hope that they'll be able to change those numbers back.
Scott Walter, president of the Capital Research Center, is on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Your piece ties Black Lives Matter to a terrorist group. Tell us what you found, and were you surprised? Did you kind of expect it there? It seems like domestically they're working on terror. They're burning people's shops down. They're threatening private property ownership. Tell us what you found.
Well, this really, even to me, who spends his life studying the left, this was off the charts. Something in this general kind is not surprising, but this is really extreme. Let me explain to your listeners here. If you go to blacklivesmatter.com and you punch the donate button, you are first taken to something called Act Blue Charities, which is a pass-through platform for left-wing fundraising.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as we discovered in our Capital Research Center research on this, the Act Blue does not give that money directly to the apparent beneficiary with something called Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation. In fact, it gives it to another pass-through called Thousand Currents. And theoretically, the folks at Thousand Currents will spend that money on their project, BLM Global Network Foundation. The point is, the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation does not legally exist. It's not incorporated. It's not a recognized nonprofit. It's just a little project thing that Thousand Currents, the final pass-through group, is fiscally sponsoring. It's that is the way you put it in the term of art. Now, the thing about Thousand Currents that's off the charts is it is a left-wing pass-through nonprofit. It does exist legally, and it sends money to various projects in various issue areas, all on the left. But the vice chairman of Thousand Currents is somebody called Susan Rosenberg, and the proper title for her is Convicted Domestic Terrorist.
Wow.
She started out in the Weather Underground. If you're old enough to remember the 60s and 70s, the Weather Underground was the violent fringe group that's part of something called Students for a Democratic Society, which was one of the big anti-Vietnam War groups. The Weather Underground people, though, were less patient, and they wanted to do actual violence against the man, against the system. And Rosenberg started out there and then got into increasingly more radical, more extreme, more violent groups. She was one of the co-founders of something called the May 19th Communist Organization. Now, that's their title, not mine, so please let's have nobody scandalized that I use the word communist, because they proudly called themselves communists, and May 19th was named for the birth date shared by Malcolm X and by Ho Chi Minh, the communist tyrant of North Vietnam. Now, in the May 19th organization, she was mixed up in multiple bombings and cop killings. Also, they broke out of prison one of the most famous cop killers of the day, a woman who called herself Asada Shakur. She had to flee the country after they busted her out of jail, and she's still alive, and she's still exactly where she went. She went to the more convenient communist tyranny of Cuba, where they happily took her in.
Mm-hmm.
So now, you're talking about the electoral politics of all this. When Susan Rosenberg was finally caught, it was in the early 80s, and she and her fellow trained Marxist, domestic terrorist extremists, they were trying to ruin, they were fighting that brutal, vicious tyranny that you may have heard of. It's called the first Reagan term.
Yeah.
So Reagan was in his first term. They had to fight that monstrosity. Wasn't nearly as beautiful and lovely as what Ho Chi Minh and Castro had. Those were lovely regimes that everybody would want to live in. So they were blowing things up and killing people, and because the only thing worse than the monstrosity of the first Reagan term was, of course, the prospect of a second Reagan term. But she was caught with 740 pounds of stolen explosives,
Jeez.
as well as an awful lot of guns.
I remember that, yeah.
And ammo. So
yeah,
I guess she's at least a Second Amendment supporter, perhaps. But
so fighting second terms of conservative presidencies is old hat for her. Now, am I correct that Thousand Currents was actually a part of the Tides Foundation?
I'm going to be embarrassed if you saw that on Influence Watch. They get money from lots of.
Oh, okay.
They
Maybe
get
that's
money
it.
from lots of places.
Oh, okay. Maybe that's what I saw. Was
I
it?
don't think that they're a project. In fact, they have even themselves funneled money to the Tides Foundation.
Okay, so maybe that was
This is
it.
one of the confusing things about the left, that they left-wing entities. There's pass-through upon pass-through, and one pass-through may give money to another pass-through. So it makes your head spin. The best place to go check all that out is our website, influencewatch.org. And I'm just double-checking as we talk. I see that the Thousand Currents has given money to Tides, but it doesn't look like it has received money from Tides.
You talk about pass-throughs. Each pass-through takes its cut, too. So there's, and I think there's a word for it in law enforcement. Isn't this what they would traditionally call like a money laundering operation? Because I'm sure the amount of money you give to Black Lives Matter, if you go to blacklivesmatter.com and give them $10, I'm sure that all 10 of those dollars make it to Black Lives Matter, correct?
Well, you're quite right that there's always fees associated with pass-throughs. And by the way, I'm looking. I misspoke. Thousand Currents has given money to Tides Foundation and received money from Tides Foundation. But yes, I mean, if it reminds you of Three Card Monte, one of the con games on the streets of New York, famously. Yes, if it reminds you of criminal operations, if you have a mob. The mobs or something not terribly distant from mobs, the unions. No union has one pension fund. They have 12 pension funds.
Right.
And the money flips between this and that. And it's really funny. There's a word, the opposite of this, and it's transparency. But you hear the word transparency in the mouths of left-wingers often, but you don't always see it in their actual operations. The same for dark money. That's a monster and boogeyman that right-wing people do.
Right.
But no left-winger has ever been mixed up in anything like dark money.
No, and they want you to see everything right out in front. They just have to tell the MSNBC host, this is what you call it, and that's should be sufficient. Scott, amazing stuff. And when you mention the Weather Underground, I think of Ayers and Dorn. And if I'm now, Act Blue used to be known as Organizing for America, which used to be known as the Obama campaign in 2008, unless I missed a step in there, correct?
Well, you're right about the Obama campaign just turning into a C4, which, by the way, is the classic definition of dark money. And then you have the and then it changed its name one more time, and then Act Blue serves all kinds of left-wing fundraising efforts. Act Blue is actually complicated. It's one brand, but legally it's three different entities or pots of money. There's just plain vanilla Act Blue, which is a PAC, 527 PAC, and it's used by things like the Biden campaign and whatnot. All these are online. Act Blue specializes in online fundraising. So there's the PAC version of Act Blue, and it exists to be a pass-through to C4 groups. And then there's also Act Blue Charities, which is a C3, and it exists to be a pass-through for left-wing charities like Thousand Currents, the fiscal sponsor of Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation. So how's that for transparency?
Very, very transparent. I put in verbal air quotes. And if you go and start digging around, if you look around the Virginia campaigns of the last 4 or 5, you will find Act Blue in just about every Senate race, every House race, and quite active in last General Assembly race in 2017 as well. Lots of candidates, Lee Carter, folks like that, getting tons of money from Act Blue, and it's stunning. Scott, thank you for the work you've done. How can people help support what you do at the Capitol Research Center?
Well, the best place to research is our site, influencewatch.org. It's an online encyclopedia of all these groups and people and the rest. And then our main website is capitalresearch.org. And I'd encourage folks to go there and sign up for our weekly email that will give you the highlights of each week's research. And obviously, you're welcome to support us there as well.
As a quick note, Act Blue, $156,703 as per VPAP to Northam for governor, just saying. Scott, thank you so much for everything you do, and thank you for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you all for joining us as well. For all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, my name is Joe Thomas. Until next week, find us online at virginiainstitute.org and find our podcast archives online at youtube.com and search Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Until then, so long, and thanks for all the fish.